So, does it make any difference at all? Does it matter? When it's all said and done, does any of it really matter? Do you ever ask yourself that? Does what I say, does what I do, does any of it make any difference in the long run? Does it matter? See, those are the questions that are following me around these days. Having to sort of report into the conference, well, how many years have you been doing this? 39 and a half years of this sort of thing. And prior to that, 2 years of youth ministry, one in Denver and one at Messiah Church, ironically. So almost 42 of my 65 years have been doing this sort of thing. And I wonder, does it matter? Does it make any difference at all? In the long run, when it's all said and done, what difference does it make? And now I am not fishing for anything, so I don't need to hear, I don't need reassurance. I'm not looking for that. I really don't need to hear any of that. Thank you. I need to be with the questions. I really do. On my own behalf and with you and for you. Because those are our questions. Does this church thing matter? Does it make any difference? Does it do anything besides make us feel a little better for a while? What difference does it make? I said, I'm not fishing for anything, and I'm not. Peter is, and he stated that outright. I'm going fishing, he said. He doesn't know what to do with this whole situation, and he's got a whole lot of stuff he's hauling around. Now, this is John chapter 21. I think originally there were only 20 chapters in John. I think it ended at the end of chapter 20, and this was added on because the early church, somebody needed more. This wasn't getting the job done. So this is added on. And I think it represents the struggle in John's community and in the early church with the whole concept of resurrection. What do you do with it? What do you say about it? How do you explain it? It's difficult. And if you were here on Easter Sunday, you saw that the struggle continues. I had a plan for the children's time here of how I was going to talk to the kids about Easter. Do you remember that? And at the end, after I'd gone round and round and round and round and round and round and asked, did it make any sense? And somebody said, no. And it didn't. It really didn't. It went off the rails. I don't know what I said, frankly. And it was true. It made no sense at all. Which is probably highly appropriate for anything we try to say, explaining Easter. How do you explain Easter resurrection to children? We use butterflies, we use eggs, we use the new green life of spring, we use other things, but it all falls short because we don't get Easter. We don't get resurrection. If anything, it gets us. And Peter and the disciples have not been got yet in the text today. So when Peter says, I'm going fishing, they say, we'll go with you. It sounds like a good idea. Because they don't know what to do with it either. It doesn't fit with their view of the world. It doesn't fit with their way of being. They don't know where to put it, what to make of it. So when that happens, as I was talking with Ari about, when we're confronted by something that is not resolvable, that we can't manage, what do? We talked about that. One of the things we often do is revert. I don't know what to do with this. Let's get the boat, get the nets, get the cooler, get the fishing rods, let's go. Let's get out of here. Go away. It's their version of our mowing our lawns, spraying poison on the things we don't want there, driving around in our fossil-fueled vehicles and going to eat chunks of animals that are raised unsustainably. All of this is part of a world and a way that has to go. It's not sustainable. It's killing our planet, and we know it. But we'll let the next generation make the jump. We're going fishing. And I'm guilty of that. And it haunts me. But I think it's true. So they go fishing. What's the result? Nothing. They catch nothing. Zilch, zippo, nada. Not a thing. So when the fishmonger shows up, a.k.a. the risen one, they don't know who he is. And he calls out, "You got any fish?" They say, "We got nothing. Check with us tomorrow." And so then he might move on to the next group of fisher folk, but instead he says, maybe you should put your net on the other side of the boat. Now, really, there's fish on this side of the boat. It's not a huge boat. There's fish over here, but there's not fish over here. We didn't think we're not catching. Is this a literal thing? No, it is not. I think it's a suggestion to the early church. You have probably gathered into your boat as many fellow Jews as you're going to get. It's time to fish on the Gentile side. It's time to open things up if you haven't done so already. And when they follow this direction, this suggestion in the story, what happens? They're overwhelmed with the abundance of God. That's what it suggests. Their efforts will not sustain them. They're doing things the way they've always done them, going back to do them again, not sustainable, won't get them where they need to go. But if you listen, this is a new world, this is a new way, there is abundance in it. That's an ongoing message. That's a continuing message for church, I think. And maybe one we need to hear especially now, in this challenging time for church. Whatever that means, fishing on the other side of the boat, they get more than they need. And one of the disciples that John designates as the one that Jesus loved, he just tolerated the others, but this one he loved. I've been doing this too long. That's the stuff that comes into my head. The beloved disciple says to Peter, "It's him. It's the guy. It's Jesus. It's the risen one." And that kicks off this whole sequence of events. Peter jumps into the water, throws himself in as the nets are thrown in. He casts himself in, throwing caution to the wind. And there's conversation between him and Jesus on the shore where the three questions, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love?" Yeah, yes, yes, yes. The affirmation 3 times to redeem the 3 denials from earlier in the story when Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And then the breakfast on the beach. That's a Eucharistic scene. You have the Last Supper. Now you have the first breakfast, the pre-Easter, post-Easter meal. We have goldfish in the bowls here today just because we thought pickled herring might be a little messy. So if you want a little fish, you can take a little fish with the bread and the wine. And then there is that strange line. None of the disciples dared ask Jesus who he was because they knew who it was. Well, if they knew who it was, why are they even wondering about who it is? Who are you? We know they don't know who he is. That's what that is getting at. It's the confusion in the body about who this Jesus is and what we do with him. When's he going to show up? It's the anxiety, the stress, the fear over this, the confusion over this dying, rising, not yet returning Christ in that early church. It's a really rich story, even though it's an add-on to the gospel, I think. It's full of meaning, layers of meaning and symbolism. not the least of which is the element of darkness in the story. In John's gospel, the interplay of light and darkness is a continuing theme, a repeating theme. In the resurrection story in John, remember Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb and she meets the risen Jesus. She doesn't know who he is. She thinks he's the gardener. She's in the dark until he calls her by name. In Luke's version of the resurrection story, Easter morning, the women come to the tomb to anoint the body, and they get the news that he's not here, he's risen. Go tell the others. And the women don't have the means to get from a dead body to a risen Christ. They can't. It doesn't compute until they're reminded of what Jesus said about this whole thing. This whole thing is gathered up in God. This whole thing is part of what God is doing. So trust. And then they remember, oh yeah, he talked about this. In the story today, these guys have met the risen Christ twice already, except for Thomas. He only gets one because he wasn't there. He was out getting donuts the first time they were in the upper room. Missed him. But they've met Jesus twice and they still don't get it. Literally, a new day has dawned, but they're not in it. They are still in the dark. Shame on them. What is wrong with them? Don't they have any faith at all? I pulled this book out and I've been reading little chunks of it. Leaving Church seems like a good time to read the book again. You've read it. Barbara Brown Taylor, in this section, she's talking about people's experience of God and some of the interesting ways and places people encounter the transcendent, the divine. A sweat lodge put on by a Lakota medicine man, or standing on the edge of a volcano in Hawaii, or the Grand Canyon, something like that. And people hesitate to share those experiences, she says, for fear of being shunned for their unorthodox narratives. They also feared sharing some of the most powerful things that have ever happened to them with people who might dismiss them. And then she says this: given the history of Christians as a people who started out beholding what was beyond belief, this struck me as a lamentable state of affairs, both for those who have learned to see no more than they are supposed to see, as well as for those who have excused themselves from traditional churches because they see too little or too much. This part. If it is true that God exceeds all our efforts to contain God, then is it too big a stretch to declare that dumbfoundedness is what all Christians have most in common? Or that coming together to confess all that we do not know is at least as sacred an activity as declaring what we think we do know? Questions. She ends with questions. Questions about these things that we can't get a handle on and can't explain. Yet here we are. And it's Easter. When I was in seminary, we were in Denver for 3 years, and during that time, we visited a lot of different churches. The first one we went to was University Park United Methodist Church, which is right across University Avenue from the seminary, the Iliff School of Theology, and the University of Denver. The University of Denver was originally a Methodist school, and so it sort of enfolds the seminary right there, and the church is right across the street. It's a big church, popular with the academic folks. And so when we visited there, I ran into the senior pastor outside in the corridor beside the sanctuary. And he's very friendly. Good morning, welcome, how are you? And he introduced himself. And I introduced myself, and I said, I'm doing okay, except I'll be better when I find the bathroom. And he led me to the bathroom So I consider that a true servant of God. That's an important thing. And he seemed just very down to earth. And somebody would be kind of fun to get to know. Well, the service started. He stood up in the chancel and he said something like, "Good morning, grace and peace be unto you in the name of our Lord Jesus." It was like somebody snatched the other guy away and plucked this guy in his place. It was so weird. And I decided, no, I don't think this is the place for me. So we visited 6 or 7 other churches in the Denver area. A couple of them were Lutheran, a bunch of Methodist churches. And one was quite a ways from us. We didn't go too often. It was in a new development in a suburb, fairly new church. A lot of young people there. And the pastor's name was Glenn Chambers. He was originally from Oklahoma. He was part Cherokee. And he had some of that in his voice, both the Oklahoma and the native. There was this lilt and this twang that it was just fun to listen to. And he told stories, and he had this self-deprecating, wry sense of humor. And he was articulate, and there was a gentle, easy, warm demeanor that he had. He was just immediately likable, just sort of drew you in. I loved listening to him. I just loved being in that place. Well, one Sunday we were there and he talked about the divorce that he was going through. And it just stunned me. I mean, I know divorce happens and it's a fact of life, and sometimes it needs to happen. I get that. But I had it in my head, I realized, that clergy are of a different order. And that's not supposed to happen to them. They're supposed to have more faith than that and be more gracious than that. And when the going gets tough, that they get more gracious and faithful. And they're supposed to show the rest of us the way through such times. And it sort of blew me away. And yet, he was so open, so honest, no excuses. And he talked about the pain that he had caused, the grief that he felt, the brokenness, how he had failed, and he knew it. And the darkness he felt he was stumbling around in, and the darkness he felt was rattling around inside himself. And yet, here he was bringing it all into church, bringing it all, if you will, to Christ. How about that? When the disciples come in off the water to meet this Jesus that they know but don't know, they bring their darkness, they bring their brokenness, they bring their failure with them. When Peter comes in, he has this personal, intense encounter with the Christ, and he confronts his own brokenness, his own failing, his own darkness. And at that very moment, he is commissioned and prepared for a brand new unknown on behalf of Christ and the church. What difference does it make? Does any of it matter at all? Whatever we say, do, does it in the long run make any difference at all? Questions. Questions. I'm going to end this time here with you with questions. I'm going to end my life with questions. What's next? What is yet to be? More questions. I'm trying to be okay with that, not needing answers, being okay with the questions, because they sort of keep me awake and on my toes. Even in retirement, I think they will. And because at some level, I believe that on the edge of my darkness and yours, the risen Christ stands there. And he calls out to you and to me, come on in, let's have breakfast. And let's talk about your new life. Let's talk about your future, for God's sake. Amen.